Today I'm going to present on one of my own papers. I was a co-author of a publication that did systematic analysis of published literature of what kind of vaccine fragments are found post-vaccination in human tissues. And of course, I should present on my own paper. I was invited by this group of scientists whose work I have frequently discussed in my videos before, specifically because I was interested in their work. How I got introduced to their work was because these were the authors that were some of the earliest that I was aware of who published information on spike protein detoxification. And I met one of the scientists, Matthew Halma, who often spearheads this work, and we even did a hike together. We hiked up a mountain before, and I interviewed him halfway up a mountain, which is the only interview I have ever done before. So, folks, I gotta tell you, I'm in a really slippery terrain. It is totally possible I could fall, but where I am is so pretty. I thought, well, I do want to show you this area, and if I fall, I fall, and so be it. So it is what it is. And another scientist is this is where I'm gonna be careful. I feel it already, very slippery. Another scientist is a practicing clinician. I believe his name was Dr. Joseph Farron. I don't know how to pronounce his name properly. I'm just gonna pronounce it as I read it with my phonetic abilities. But he was and is outspoken critic of some of the policies that have been enacted during, of course, the COVID pandemic. And recently I even read one of his articles that discussed where he talked about how doctors were silenced during the pandemic and how this has negatively impacted progress of medicine, because the pandemic changed the structure of what doctors were capable of doing before, which was they had that freedom of conversation and discussion and disagreement. And he claimed in that article, listen, this is part of what drives progress of medicine. And during the pandemic, this was stifled, and medical doctors who chose to speak out against the narrative were frequently punished. And as a consequence, this has resulted in silencing doctors, even if many doctors had different ideas about the narrative. And that's because their careers were in jeopardy. So definitely also it's someone that of course I admire for that kind of courage like this individual displayed. So I was very excited to be included in being able to publish with this group of authors, especially since I have been such a big fan of their work in the past. And this was really interesting work to me as well. We have been hearing this persistent information on how spike protein or vaccine elements can persist for much longer period of time than what was originally anticipated. And we wanted to see, well, what kind of literature can we find and summarize all of this? And we looked at, of course, not only we focused on spike protein, we focused on the genetic material as well. We also focused on the lipid nanoparticles. So that was that one component. Another focus was where were these elements, or as we call them, artifacts, found in human tissues? What kind of assays were done in order to detect all of this? We also discuss potential explanation why the persistence of these elements might be present. Yeah, let me tell you all about that. We also, one more element we also analyzed historical information of mRNA vaccines prior to the COVID pandemic outbreak. So let me tell you briefly about that. So the earliest mRNA vaccine of any type clinical trial that took place was in 2013, and it was a vaccine against rabies, and this wasn't published till 2017. But overall, this means that there was potentially 7 years of data collection prior to the mass vaccination with COVID-19 mRNA vaccines in 2020, and approximately 5 years of observation in mRNA vaccines that use those synthetic uridines called N1 methyl pseudouridines as a component of the mRNA vaccines, which is of course the hallmark of the COVID-19 vaccines. Overall, we found 7 clinical trials prior to the COVID-19 outbreaks with mRNA vaccines, and these vaccines looked for rabies, influenza, and HIV. And the longest duration in all of these vaccines that analyzed for information was about 1 year. However, these vaccines only looked for information related to immunological responses. None of them looked for biodistribution of the components or persistence of any of the components. So in essence, that data didn't exist. So therefore, the information that we had prior to the pandemic and was based on assumptions, and the assumption was that these components of these vaccines will be degraded rapidly, as would be expected from naturally occurring biological phenomena. But we really didn't have any data to back up those claims, which kind of teaches you that, hey, when we were told at the very beginning this will be cleared very quick, and when the authorities sometimes speak with this air of authority about what we think is happening, sometimes again this is based on total assumptions. Alright guys, this is something very cool I have to show you. So check this out. This is probably the jewel of this hike, and why I decided to take the risk on this icy path, but I didn't bring cleats with me. Check this out. How cool is this? So you get to walk behind a waterfall that is still running. I hope you get to see that right there. Very neat. Okay, so that's the information prior to, of course, COVID. Now, in terms of what was published once mass vaccination has started, we divided into 2 tables, and the one table was for information of what was found in body fluids. So there was one, and the other one was information that was found in tissues, and that was either through biopsies or autopsies. Okay, and overall, one table, the one in bodily fluids, that covered 12 publications. We mentioned 13, but it's actually 12 because one of it was a duplicate publication being mentioned. And in terms of tissues, it was only 7 publications. So in total, there's only 19 publications that assess any of this information. And let me tell you all about it right now. So I'm going to break it down for you slightly differently than we did it in a paper. Might as well do it slightly differently. And I'm going to tell you based on spike protein versus mRNA versus the lipid nanoparticle components. Okay, so let's start with the spike protein. There was 9 publications total discussing spike protein persistence, and the longest observed duration was in plasma, so component of blood, which was 709 days, almost 2 years, 1 year, 11 months. So that's the longest recorded so far. However, there was no proof that this was vaccinal spike protein. It could not be with certainty. The fact that this could actually be a spike protein from virus could not be discounted at all. And that's one of the persistent problems that we see in literature about this topic. So keep that in mind. So it's recorded as 709 days, but we really don't know if that's spike protein from vaccine or not. And the reason why this is legitimate to question that, and that this could also be from virus as well, is because of the fact that, look, there's continuously mounting evidence that mRNA vaccinated individuals are more likely to be infected now, paradoxically and ironically, than those who are either non-vaccinated or might have taken other vaccines. And the reason why is because of these unusual production of IgG4 antibodies against the spike protein. I covered that in numerous videos now. So that is a legitimate possibility as to why we should be looking at the source of the spike protein, because it does not necessarily mean it was from vaccine, even if there was no record of infection, because one could now have also asymptomatic infection. Also in blood, there was one publication that did prove it was spike protein from vaccine, and the longest recorded duration was 187 days post-vaccination. And this was by Dr. Brogna. I have discussed this in some of my past videos as well. And as far as we know, this is still the only publication that have ever shown duration of vaccinal spike protein. That's the only one that has proven it, that this is spike protein from vaccine based on analyzing amino acid sequence of the spike protein, because vaccinal spike protein has couple amino acid change in 2 adjacent locations to keep it in a specific 3-dimensional conformation shape. Okay, so that's blood. The second longest duration ever recorded was 17 months, and that was in cerebral arteries for spike protein. Moving down, and again, you could not discount the possibility that this could have been viral spike protein. Authors specifically state that also in their paper, and in that specific paper as well. Going down the ladder, is next one was spike protein discovered in monocyte cells. So those are a type of immune cells, and this was the duration there was 245 days. But once again, the authors did not prove that this was vaccinal spike protein, and it could not be discounted that this could be from asymptomatic viral infection. So you can see there's an issue with that. Next longest duration was in liver, 5 weeks duration. And after that, it was heart, brain, blood vessels, and lung in autopsies, so in cadavers, between 18 to 21 days post-vaccination. And so that's the spike protein. Now let's move on to the mRNA, so the genetic component of the vaccines. So the genetic component, of course, acts as the blueprint for the cells that take up the vaccine to generate the spike protein. And this is much easier to detect because the genetic information is unique. So in order for you to even detect it, you have to detect a specific vaccine genetic information. So there is no ambiguity there. And the longest detection is again that same paper that looked at the cerebral arteries. And again, so we're talking about 17 months. And this is probably, for that reason, this is probably the most serious finding that that I would see out of all that published literature. And it's also, I believe, the only one that covered both the spike protein and the mRNA. However, you would think, okay, listen, they found spike protein and they found vaccinal mRNA. Clearly, that should indicate that that spike protein was from vaccine. But no, and the reason why is because they also found viral genetic information for spike protein from the virus in that same location where they found spike protein genetic information from the vaccine. So you could not tell, where did that spike protein come from? Did it come from the vaccine genetic information, or did it come from the virus infection genetic information? So we cannot know for sure unless the same authors were to specifically analyze that spike protein amino acid sequence. All right, so that was 17 months. The next one, longest, was lymph nodes, and that was lymph nodes. mRNA was discovered in lymph nodes for 60 days post-vaccination. Now, that actually is not that unusual because lymph nodes can process information for a while post-infection or post-encounter, like vaccine. So this one, I would put it into the category of that could be a normal event, okay? So next one after that was plasma, again, 28 days. So mRNA circulating in a plasma was for 28 days. Going down the ladder, next one was, I believe it was heart, that was 19 days. Then liver, I believe that was 12 days. And then breast milk, which was 7 days. And I did make video on that specifically as well in the past as well, so you can check that out for more details. In terms of the total number of publications, I don't know if I mentioned, with the mRNA, that was 10 publications. Now, in terms of the lipid nanoparticles, there was only one publication that we found, and it looked at one of the lipids that were very specific and unique for the makeup of that lipid nanoparticle, and its duration. It was discovered in plasma, and it was discovered up to 7 days post-vaccination. Okay, so that in a nutshell breaks down everything that we know so far what was published. So very limited data, very scarcely published. We still don't actually properly know biodistribution of the vaccine spike protein post-vaccination after so many years, which is wild. And another thing is, many of these publications, they were detecting these elements right at the limit of those analytical assays. So they were literally they were discovering very minute amounts. So that also puts it into question, how realistic is it in terms of the potential longevity of and potential harm to the biological system of these trace elements. Another thing we focused on was how fast were these elements decayed. So we looked at the decay kinetics, and there's only a couple of publications that we saw that really investigated this, and one of the publications looked at the mRNA, and mRNA, they published that after 28 days post-vaccination, the mRNA in the blood was down to 0.00 nanograms per milliliter, so really trace amounts as well, from all the way to 0.5 nanograms per milliliter as the top value immediately post-vaccination. That same publication also looked at that lipid nanoparticle ions, and they showed that the decay of or disappearance of that specific ion in the blood was about 2 to 3 times faster than what they observed for the mRNA. There's one more paper that looked at the decay of the N1-methyl pseudouridine mRNA, and the half-life of that is approximately 5 to 6 days. If you're curious what a typical half-life of normal natural mRNA in our bodies is, it's about 16 hours. So that allowed us to calculate, based on the amount of mRNA that was injected into people, either with Pfizer or Moderna, Pfizer being 30 micrograms, Moderna was 100 micrograms. If you wanted to decay it completely down to nothing, this could take anywhere between 260 to 270 days, based on that rough calculation. So that was the decay parameters that we also analyzed. And in terms of limitations of these analytical assays, as I already mentioned, these assays, they oftentimes were just what I wanted to say is that detection itself does not necessarily mean that it equates to any biological harm. And the reason why is because, as I already mentioned, oftentimes the detection was right at the limit of these assays, so they were really detecting trace amounts. Many of these assays, it's simply their superb sensitivity of assays that allows these assays to detect something at such small amounts that it might not be biologically relevant. And most of these publications never actually assessed any functional outcome of what they were discovering at all in those biological tissues. There's few, of course, that correlated between the discovery and certain disease outcomes. So those are such as strokes or liver inflammation. But these papers really didn't analyze what does it mean if we discover these trace amounts of either the spike protein or this genetic information in terms of its biological impact. So my point is that it's not necessarily something that we have to really worry about, that these trace amounts were discovered. And unfortunately, we don't have any better information at the moment in terms of understanding really what does it all mean from a biological point of view. And one of the statements in the paper was that we need more of this information. We need to understand these pharmacokinetics of these elements, such as the spike protein and the mRNA, to really know what happens in the body once they are introduced to the body. Where did it go? How long do they last? What did they do biologically? We don't have any of that information, and that is something yet for us to really obtain that information. And I think, and of course, we claim in the paper we need to know this information if we want to continue using this technology safely in the future. And another big statement was that proving that the spike protein is a vaccine origin is really challenging. And I've discussed this in past videos as well, where I explain in detail as to why it's so challenging to determine the sequence of the spike protein that is being discovered in the tissues, which is why almost none of these papers, except that one I mentioned, ever do this. So that challenge really prevents us from really knowing what is happening post-vaccination. So those are the massive limitation of what has been published so far. Now, in terms of why, but clearly there is some information that suggests that the vaccine elements could persist. And what we also discuss as to why that might be. So of course we already mentioned there's that delayed decay of the genetic material itself. It lasts longer than your typical mRNA, so that's one possibility. And another one, of course, is the spike protein might last longer as well. So in terms of half-life of the spike protein, there is really limited data. In terms of half-life of the spike protein from vaccines, as far as we know, based on our analysis, there's nothing published. So according to our search, nothing has been published for us to understand that at all. And in terms of viral spike protein, there has been one publication we found, and it discovered that the spike protein half-life is over 8 hours, which means it can last quite a long time. It's quite resilient, which is one of the reasons why we specifically mention that absence of nucleocapsid protein, which is a protein found inside the SARS-CoV-2 virus, is not evidence of absence of infection. And the reason why is because a person could be infected and nucleocapsid protein, which has a shorter half-life than spike protein, could disappear over time while the spike protein still could persist. So this is one of the issues we find with many of these publications that attempt to claim that spike protein came from vaccine because they did not discover nucleocapsid protein. And we think that spike protein from vaccine could potentially last even longer than the viral spike protein because of the mutations that were introduced to the spike protein in order to stabilize it in a specific three-dimensional shape, three-dimensional conformation, and that might allow it to even last longer. But that's a speculation because, again, there's no information on that at all. So those could be couple reasons. Another one is lipid nanoparticles potentially could persist longer in certain tissues. And one more that we talked about is that perhaps certain cells, including bacterial cells, could act as reservoirs for vaccines, and therefore they could stick around. Elements of the vaccine could stick around longer in such tissues or cell types. One more, of course, is the possibility of integration of the genetic information into cells, but this is theoretically possible. I did cover that in one of my earliest Patreon account videos, but this would be very remote chance, and there is no good empirical data at all to truly support that idea. There has been couple publications that I'm aware of that attempted to claim they discovered proof of integration of vaccine genetic material into cellular tissues, but the proof of it was very weak, and I discussed that in my past videos as well. It would not be the type of proof that I would consider would be good enough to really support that claim at all. So the point is that all of these claims I just made as to what could be the cause of persistence, these are all theoretical, and none of them have been proven yet in any way. So at this point, we are only speculating. So the take-home message is that yes, there seems to be some evidence that vaccine elements can persist, but whatever is being discovered, typically it's fragmented, it's typically in tiny trace amounts, and therefore we can't really know whether that would be of any biological significance because the trace the trace amounts that are being discovered are far below what is typically done in experimental settings to indicate any biological impact or influence, which is I suppose at the moment it's a bit of a relief, because I know that in my audience, a lot of audience worries about this persistence of vaccines post-vaccination as if it's a permanent effect. But the data, the scarce data that we have so far, does not seem to be really indicative of that. All right, and of course it means we should continue with these studies and really determine this. We need more studies to really determine all of this. So that wraps it up. One more thing that I should mention is that this article that I read by Dr. Joseph I'm gonna pronounce his name as Varon, maybe it's Varon. He also mentioned about this concept of COVID Justice Initiative, which I never heard of before, which is really interesting. It's I don't know how to call it. It's an initiative that is attempting to collect information about what has happened during the pandemic in terms of eroding civil liberties, and to make sure that this doesn't happen again in another future health crisis. And I thought that was really interesting, because that is exactly what we need. Because to me it seems like when the pandemic happened, we just panicked and we enacted methods that were actually, now looking back, really archaic and very destructive. And there is more and more supporting evidence of that in terms of how destructive lockdowns were and mandates and so on. And I never heard of this initiative before, but I thought I would mention that clearly there is some steps in attempts to make sure that citizens' legal rights are protected from such a draconian behavior of the governments, like what we have seen during the pandemic. So something is happening, but I did not come across that in scientific literature. This was just an article on some website I read. I read it because I recognized the author, and I was like, why? I just published an article with this person as a co-author, and I wanted to read it, and it was really interesting. So check that out. Also, the article we published is fairly short, so check that out as well. That's it for me for today. So please like, please subscribe, please leave a comment. You know how this works. This all is very beneficial to YouTube algorithms. And also please check out my Patreon account, my private account. You can subscribe to that account for free. There's some free information. All my blog articles are now published on Patreon, and there's some free content as well. And not all of the content that is published there migrates to YouTube. Almost all of my content is published on Patreon first before it migrates to YouTube. And some of it is behind a paywall, so there's also supporting patrons who pay for the privilege of seeing that first, and helping me decide as to what should make it to YouTube. One more thing I should mention. You know what? Since then, there is also a couple more publications that I'm aware of that discussed presence of spike protein and the genetic material, I believe, in both, or at least genetic material in both the placenta as well as sperm. And I published a video on one of these, but that one is available for free, but only on Patreon, because that publication was somewhat controversial. It's one of those very rare publications that publish some evidence suggesting that shedding might be taking place. And recently there was another publication that confirmed as well presence of this vaccine material in placenta as well. But I haven't studied that one yet, but I'm aware of it, and I'm interested in studying that further. So there is, since we did this review and we published that, more tissues have been now documented in terms of presentation of vaccinal artifacts as well. All right, that's it from me for today, and see you guys next time. Bye everyone.